Hello, and welcome to Keep the Channel Open, a podcast featuring conversations with artists, writers, and curators. My name is Mike Sakasagawa, and this is episode 62. Today's guest is Devin Kelly. Hey, folks. So, I've been thinking a bit about literary comfort food lately. Mainly because I'm way ahead of schedule on my reading goal for this year, and so I've taken a bit of a break on more quote-unquote serious reading for the last week or so and just plowed through a few books that I picked just for entertainment. Now, for me, there's a difference between comfort food and guilty pleasures, mainly because I don't believe in guilty pleasures. I think, if you like something, if it makes you feel good and isn't hurting anybody, what's the point of feeling guilty about it? But comfort food, that's not about guilt. It's not even necessarily something that's bad for you. It's just the thing that you come back to over and over again, that you can just enjoy in an uncomplicated way, Something that you just like and you don't have to try to figure it out or analyze it. It's just the thing that you know and love. For me, book-wise, that's usually epic fantasy novels, and it's not that there isn't highbrow, complicated, fancy genre fiction out there. There certainly is, and I like a lot of that as well. But often when I want to just relax and have a good time, what I end up turning to is something with a bit of adventure to it, And I think that when it comes to both food and reading, that feeling of comfort is often very wrapped up with nostalgia, In order for it to be real comfort food, it has to be something very familiar, something that's been in your life for a long time. I don't know. I think a lot of people have a way of looking down on certain kinds of books, especially the kind that you'd call comfort food. But there's something about these stories that lets you access a register of emotions that is very deep inside you. Anyway, that's what's on my mind at the moment, but let me ask you, what's your literary comfort food? Tweet at me at ChannelOpenPod and let me know. Okay, so on to today's show. Devin Kelly earned his MFA from Sarah Lawrence College and is the author of 2 collaborative chapbooks as well as 2 collections of poetry, Blood on Blood, published by Unknown Press, and In This Quiet Church of Night I Say Amen, published by Civil Coping Mechanisms. His work has been published in numerous journals and magazines. Some of the ones we mentioned in this episode include Lit Hub, Flapper House, and Goodnight Sweet Prince. He is the Director of Enrichment Programming for the Sunnyside Community Services Youth Futures Program at Queens Vocational High School, as well as a teacher at the City College of New York. And he is the founder and co-host of the Dead Rabbits reading series and currently lives in Harlem. So, I first became acquainted with Devin's work when somebody, and I can't remember who, retweeted an essay of his last summer. It was called Running Toward My Father. We talked briefly about it in the conversation you're about to hear, but, the piece just really resonated with me. It's this sort of meditation on running and family and what you do and don't know about your parents and what it's like to be someone's son. It's just really right up my alley. And so since then, whenever I see a new piece by Devin Kelly, I make the time for it. I bought his latest book, In This Quiet Church of Night I Say Amen, and I read it just after the new year. And it was just beautiful, very contemplative, full of this feeling of longing that felt very familiar to me, and so much of it seems to be defined by the distance between two people or by this sense of searching, of life being a question more than any answer. I definitely recommend it. And speaking of which, I just happen to have 2 copies of that book that I'm going to be giving away, so stick around after the conversation for details about that. Now let's get started. As always, if you'd like to join in the conversation, you can use the hashtag ChannelOpenPod on Twitter. And now here's my conversation with Devin Kelly. So, I just read your book. I think it was last week, and I really enjoyed it. And I was kind of hoping that we might be able to start with, if you're willing to read something from it.
Yeah, I have it right here. I actually was flipping through to try and figure out what I would read. I'll do Elegy for the long drive.
Oh, I like that one a lot.
Oh, good. I'm glad. I was going to just ask you what you wanted. Okay. Elegy for the long drive. When Pops aired his words over space to tell me Grandma had a heart attack, I couldn't hear the quiver in his voice. I had just bought coffee in Queens for $1, and the steam of it when held close to me made the inside of my nose sweat. You are someone made by her, I wanted to say. Can you cry for me, Dad? But no, we talked quiet and stern like two boys tucked away in the corner of a schoolyard, pretending it's something larger than themselves. We are all someone made. God is the space between the last word of a sentence and a question mark. A heart attack is the shake a pen makes as it scribbles along a page. It's all so very human. Most nights before sleep, I think of the slow, rolling heave of my father's gut, of the breathing in and breathing out, of his hands nearing the pigment-drained, speckled stage of old age. When my grandma dies, tonight in a hospital bed or tomorrow, I will remember the hush of her slippers as they shuffled across the floor. I will begin a sentence with, didn't she, or isn't this where, or I can't believe, or she was so. Notice the space where I didn't place a question mark. I don't believe in God anymore. I believe in my father, and that long drive years ago through the whiteout, where even the truckers pulled to the side of the road, the snow a steady horizontal machine of erasure, where we passed through the names of towns, so plains-like and lilted I could have sworn the snow pattering against the window was the brush drum of the song we inhabited. Painted Post, Cooper's Plain, Savona. My father turned the radio low, and from the back seat I marbled him into a statue made of miles. Most people forget the woman who shouted out at Jesus, "Blessed is the womb that bore you." My father didn't. Each winter he drove back toward it under cover of darkness. Each winter he taught me, without words, how to write an elegy.
Thank you. That just by coincidence, that was one of my favorites in the whole book. So I'm glad to have the chance to hear you read it.
No problem.
So one of the things about this book that I was thinking about, so the title is "In This Quiet Church of Night, I Say Amen."
Sure.
And one of the things that it made me think about, and especially with that poem, is about prayer. Mm-hmm. There's this C.S. Lewis quotation that I think it gets paraphrased a lot, but the way that he put it was, "I pray because I can't help myself. I pray because I'm helpless. I pray because the need flows out of me all the time, waking and sleeping. It doesn't change God, it changes me."
That's good. I've never heard that.
Yeah, and it's that thing at the end, the paraphrase I see a lot is that prayer doesn't change the world, but it does change you, kind of thing.
Sure.
And I was I was thinking about that sort of in the context of this book, because I'm not personally religious, but a lot of these poems, they feel like prayer to me. They feel like they do sort of the same thing. And I was sort of wondering, you say in that poem, "I don't believe in God anymore," but I was kind of wondering if prayer informs your poetry somehow.
Yeah. That's the first time I heard that C.S. Lewis quote, and I really resonate with it. I think that, I grew up pretty staunchly Catholic, like the whole 9 yards. Like, I was an altar boy, and I had an uncle who was a priest, and, I thought about becoming a priest when I was really little. And, went to mass every day toward the end of high school. it's something I sort of grow out is the wrong word, because that makes it sound like it's a phase. But my commitment to the practice waned a lot. But I think that the way I sort of grew up with like such an emphasis on mining the world through a spiritual lens is something I still very much relate to. I think that a lot of our life is prayer, whether or not we acknowledge it, because prayer, I think, doesn't have to be a strictly religious thing, and some secular things that we do are a kind of prayer. I think writing a poem is a kind of prayer. I think asking a question is a kind of prayer. I think asking for anything is a sort of prayer, because so much of faith is believing against whatever rationality that something exists, whether it's out there to help you or harm you. And so I'm sort of spewing shit right now, but I'm very, very interested as a person, and not just a poet, in all the things we don't know, and in mystery. And I think that no matter how much you know, this is like a fact, no matter how much you know, there will always be much more that you don't.
Yeah.
And I think that this fact is one of the few facts of the world.
Yeah.
And it's so simple, right? Like that no matter how smart you get or how much you encounter, there will always be a growing amount of things that you will never encounter.
Yeah.
And there's a kind of deep anxiety there and sadness, because you want to know everything, and you want to touch everything and feel everything and be with everything, but you won't.
Yeah.
And religion is a beautiful, in my opinion, even though I don't really practice it in a traditional way, religion is a beautiful way to sort of come to a place where you're growing to be okay with that. And there are a lot of ways to do that. And I think for me, writing poetry has sort of almost replaced that, because it's just a mining of all these things that we don't know, and trying to find within a poem, more so than almost any other space, I'm very much okay with what I don't know. That is the short answer. I could have just said that. See, it took me a long time.
No, that was great. And I think a lot about this. I write. I haven't published poems, but occasionally I will write one, and I do think a lot about sort of about how a poem functions. Like what it does for the reader, if there is one. In my case, there usually isn't, except for myself. Although I guess that counts.
Sure.
But also what it does for the writer. Like I think I it's something that I always sort of wonder, the act of making this thing, what's that doing for me? Because I have this sense that it's doing something, but it's not always obvious,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's... Go on, sorry.
No, I mean, I guess, well, like in the context of Elegy for the Long Drive,
Sure.
That poem is, it's one of the longer ones in the book. Like you have poems of varying lengths. There's a fair number of words in it, but the scene that I imagine as I read it is one that I have to imagine was pretty quiet, and more. You even talk about this in the poem and elsewhere about how the moment is really defined by silence. And so, like, this is sort of a thing that I take from it, that the poem might be trying to say something that couldn't be said at that time, and so then I wonder, is the poem there to try to build a bridge? And is it, if it is it a bridge between two people now, like yourself and your father now, or is it maybe between yourself now and yourself then? Like, what is it that the poem is writing towards, if that makes sense, you know?
Yeah, that makes sense. It's interesting. I was teaching this. I teach a class at City College, and this semester I'm teaching an intro to lit class, and we are doing a poetry section. And this morning I taught this poem by Robert Hayden called "Those Winter Sundays." Have you heard it?
I don't think so, no.
It's one of the ones he's most known for, and it's a short poem. I could almost recite it by memory. It's a short poem about young Robert Hayden and how his dad would get up early in the winter on Sunday after a long week of work, and he has this phrase, with hands that ached from labor in the weekday weather, made banked fires blaze. And it's about his dad getting up before Robert did to start a fire in this house that's like dreadfully cold. And the poem is like, I think it might be a sonnet. It's like 14 lines, but the first 10 lines or so are just description. It's just Robert waking up and realizing that his dad has spent the morning like the dawn, waking up early despite having woken up early all week for work to make the house warm. And then the last two lines are, what did I know of love's austere and lonely offices? And the whole poem is just about older Robert being like, holy shit, I never thanked my dad. And that's it. And I was teaching it, and it's just really funny that you asked this question, because it's been on my mind all day. And we were going through like this sort of cycle for my students about moving through the poem, and one student raised her hand and we were talking about some things, like we talk occasionally about like things that we wish the poem did, which might be unfair, but we do it anyway. And she said that she wished the poem had a happier ending. And she wished that it wasn't this question, that it wasn't Robert Hayden saying, what did I know? Like, I fucking wish I said thank you. I wish I knew then that my dad was doing all these things out of love. And she wished that he, instead of saying, what did I know, that he actually acted on that acknowledgement, on that regret. And I was really struck by that, because I don't know if that would have made it a better poem, but it would have made it a better real life moment, right? Like that you actually get that moment of the son saying thank you to the father. And so to sort of, that was just the first thing I thought of when you asked that question, because I don't really know what a poem does at all, to be honest. I think that a lot of art is inherently selfish, in that, and not necessarily in a bad way, but an artist is someone with some sort of discipline or talent or gift, however you want to put it, for their own self-expression. And I think poems, for me, can be very transformative to me, to help me understand something. And even if they're about something universal or political, it's always filtered through me trying. It's always through me. It has to be through me. Otherwise, it wouldn't be my poem. And I was talking to someone else. I don't really like to tell people that I'm a poet. I'd rather say that I'm a teacher. I'm almost more proud to be a teacher. And so, to your question, like, there are a lot of things that I've never told my father to his face, but I've written them in poems because I feel like I have more permission there. And a good chunk of me doesn't feel good about that. Because what's accomplished there, you know? It's accomplished when my dad reads my poems and asks me about it, or sometimes makes fun of me for saying it, and then we have a conversation. But so many of those poems that are personal in the book they're selfish because they're for me. and that's a weird thing to admit. And then they become like public artifacts, and people talk about them, or they share them, or they say nice things about them, and it's really, the whole thing is both really, really beautiful and inspiring, and it means a lot to me. It's also really strange, you know, because some of the things I've talked to people about after giving a reading or someone who's read my poems are things that I should just be talking to my dad about, you know?
Yeah.
And that's just what's interesting. Again, that was another long answer.
No, that's the kind of answer I'm looking for. But it's interesting, you know. So I'm primarily, my art form is photography. I write as well, but you know, anything that I've actually presented to an audience before has mostly been as a photographer, and my photography is very drawn out of my life and very much about sort of my own interior processes. And there's a way that can feel very selfish, you know, because I do use my work as a way of sort of working through my emotions.
Yeah, sure.
And hearing you say that thing where you almost would rather, you feel more proud of calling yourself a teacher than a poet, to me, that resonates with me, because a lot of times when I'm thinking about my artwork, it does feel like it's something that's for me primarily, whereas other aspects of my life are things that the things I feel most proud of are the things where I'm doing things for other people, you know, like where I'm being of service.
Sure.
But there's an aspect, and I always have a hard time applying this to myself and my work, but it's not something that I ever have a problem applying to other people's work, of that I always find this kind of work where it's personal and where maybe it feels selfish to the person making it, but to me, it feels like an act of generosity, you know, to let other people in that way feels like a gift to me. Because the greatest thing about any piece of art, for me at least, is the ability to connect with another person in a way that makes you feel less alone. And I feel like poems like yours, like these ones, you know, they're obviously the product of some experience or emotion that you had, but they're ones that when I read them, even though I wasn't there and I didn't live that exact experience, I can be reminded of experiences that I did have that maybe I responded to in a similar way, or relationships in my own life and family that have a similar quality. And, you know, that moment of recognition is so valuable to me. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it means a lot that you would say that. I think we respond as people to not just other people's generosity, but to, I think, other people's willingness to be vulnerable around us. By that, I just mean I when you're around someone who has willingly shown you the ways in which they can be hurt and have been hurt and are susceptible to hurt, and also the ways in which they love or experience joy and have felt joy and are susceptible to joy, the whole spectrum of feeling. When you're around people and around art that is open to you in that way, then you are in the presence of someone who trusts you enough to be fully themselves. And I'm really lucky, I think, that I've never really approached a poem in any other way than to just implicitly trust the page. But I agree. I think that I just love people in art that are willing to be that vulnerable. Because that's how I feel a lot. And yeah, and I'm like, so many of the poems I love are poems that sort of engage with me on the page in that way, that they're not trying to say around the thing or to couch whatever thing they're saying in other kinds of meaning. Like, they're just trying to say the thing and describe the moment and the feeling, and to move me through that moment and feeling without even asking if I've been there or not. And so I really have a deep attachment to art and people that live and express themselves that way.
Yeah. The poems in this book, many of them, most of them really, they're full of emotion. And some of them, many of them have a sort of tenderness to them, but then many of them also are about loss or a sense of longing. You know, the question for me is never like, you know, what happened here. Like, it's not so much that I need to know the story or you know, that kind of thing. But one thing that I do sort of think about is, I say to myself, so here is this experience that this person had, and they've made something out of it and shown it to us. And now this is something that I can take in. And that's something that I often try to do with my own work as well. But for me, I find I often have to strike a balance, because if I don't have a sense of urgency, right? Like if the feeling that I want to put into the work isn't have a certain immediacy to it, then it just doesn't feel relevant enough for me to actually do the work. But then sometimes if I'm caught up in it too much, then I have trouble focusing on the craft part of it. And so I was kind of wondering how that works for you, like how your process around that kind of thing works.
Yeah, I got my start. My MFA was in fiction, and I wrote a lot of poems on the side during my MFA as sort of, I don't know what the best way to describe them is, as like brain dumps. And I didn't really take them seriously until I met people and poets in the program who gave me permission to take them seriously and shared their own work with me. And that's sort of how I came to poetry. But I always have had this sort of implicit in my poetry, this sort of narrative bent where I would rather be telling you a story. I say that because one of the hardest things I have when it comes to sort of working on a poem is to make it shorter. And that's not out of like any sort of like, I don't really have like this desire to say a long thing. I don't like value a long poem over a shorter one. But what I do value very much, and I was talking with my friend Kwame about this, I value the process by which, sort of what you were saying about urgency and immediacy, is like, oftentimes I have to write into that. Like it'll take me 10 lines of poetry, and on the 11th, I'll say the thing that I wanted to say. Or I'll finally get to the moment I wanted to tell you about. Or the moment I didn't know that I wanted to tell you about, but I'm there, and it's like, we're already like we're past the shallow ends. Like we're doggy paddling. We're like deep in the poem. And I always have this like implicit sort of struggle when I finish that initial work to be like, okay, should I cut out these first 10 lines, you know, and just begin where where the feeling begins? Or do I leave the first 10 lines as a testament to what got me there? And I almost always side with the latter. Because like, I'll be straight, like I think that there are a lot of poems in this book that could be better if they were shorter. I don't know what better means. I really don't. But maybe they could be more, to use a cliche, they could pack more of a punch, or they could be tighter, or they could be more raw and immediate, whatever, words like that. And I get that, and I like will be the first to tell people that like a lot of my 40-line poems could be 30, or they could be 15. But because I don't really know what a good poem is. I only really know what an honest poem is.
Yeah. I mean, does
And
anybody really know what a good anything is? You know, like a
yeah,
good piece of art?
this is like one of my biggest things I've been trying to practice more in my own way I talk about art is I try to refrain from ever using words like good or bad because they don't do anything. They truly don't. Like I this is like my newest like sort of hill that I'm willing to die on. They don't further a conversation. You can talk about art in ways that like if you did X, the poem might therefore do Y. And if you didn't do this, then it might refrain from doing this. Or because you did this, the poem now feels like this. And to just sit within the work rather than to just sort of just describe the work in a wholly subjective way.
Mm.
And so, yeah, I mean, to answer your question about process, for me personally, a poem is an honest sort of, it's like if you read a poem of mine, what you are getting is a blueprint for how I came to realize something or how I wrestled with something. And I want you to have all the directions. It's always, this is why I'm so remiss on cutting things. It's like if you're gonna drift away after the first 10 lines because I move too slow, then okay, like you're allowed to do that. You know, I like you go ahead and do that, you know. That's like totally your call. It's like I just want you to be there for the whole thing if you're gonna be there.
Yeah. Well, and I think the thing that you said, just, you know, maybe the poem could be tighter or something, but a tight poem is not a virtue in itself, you know.
Exactly.
It's doing something differently.
Mm-hmm.
And I know you've, you know, both in what you've talked about tonight and what I've read from you in other interviews, you talk a lot about how the search is really important to you.
Yeah.
And these poems have that quality to them where they don't feel slick, you know, like they feel like a process, like they feel like they sort of are unfolding. Mm-hmm. And there's, I don't want to use the word uncertain because the poems in themselves are not uncertain, but I feel like there is an uncertainty in how, like just an acknowledgement that life is uncertain, you know, and that what the things that we know or think we know, there's an uncertainty to that, and that the poems acknowledge that and are portraying the attempt, you know, and to me that is really largely what I like about them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that what you just said pretty much sums up a lot of what I'm trying to do with my poetry. I mean, I value that sort of wrestling with uncertainty more than I value trying to write a good poem. Again, like whatever we mean by good. Mm-hmm. I think you're right. I like when art is a reflection of process. Like I'm a big Maggie Nelson fan. Mm. I love her work, especially like Bluets, because it feels like an enactment of the wrestling that her mind is going through. And my poems are nothing like that. Like they're not sort of fragmented lyrical bits, but I value all sorts of art that are like trying to show you and enact what the person writing it or drawing it or photographing it are trying to move through themselves. Mm.
I was thinking about, I just went and read this afternoon, over my lunch break, I read the essay that you had on Goodnight Sweet Prince about Goose from Top Gun. Which I really enjoyed. And, you know, I've read, actually the first piece of yours that I read was also an essay. It was, on LitHub. I think it was called Running Towards My Father.
Yeah.
And I feel like in some ways those two pieces kind of have a lot in common. Just, I mean, stylistically, there's a lyricism to how you write prose, but one thing that I was thinking about a lot with that goose essay, which also, now that I think about it, reminds me a little bit of, you had a poem, it's not in the book, but that I read that I think it's called Caulking the Wagon.
Oh, yeah, about the Oregon Trail.
Yeah, about the Oregon Trail, where you write about these things that ostensibly the subject of the piece, whether it's a poem or an essay, is this piece of sort of pop culture that's intensely nostalgic for me. And then how you sort of unpack that into something that's sort of more than just nostalgia, simple nostalgia, and how you are really digging into what that feels like and why each of these things might have mattered to you. Mm-hmm. But, and I guess I think a lot about how nostalgia works in art, because that's also something for me that kind of, I'm always sort of contending with nostalgia in my work, and I never really want the piece to be just nostalgic, but it still seems to, I still seem to sort of want some connection to that feeling as well. And I guess I was wondering, whether nostalgia is important to you in terms of making your work and appearing in your work, that kind of thing.
One of my favorite facts about nostalgia is that during the Civil War, nostalgia was a diagnosable health condition. And if you look up death records of soldiers who died during the Civil War, many of them literally died of nostalgia.
I did not know that.
Yeah, it's a cool little tidbit. It was like a diagnosable mental health disorder. Homesickness manifested as sort of actual physical sickness, and back then it meant like a very. It's not the nostalgia we know of now. Obviously, nostalgia in that sense was like a. I guess you would call it, some sort of traumatic trauma. And mixed with homesickness and war and things that I can't even fathom. But I've always found it really interesting that there are people who have died of nostalgia. And
sometimes it feels like you're going to die from it.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I fluctuate between being someone who feels like nostalgia is a very dangerous thing, because it sort of colors the past, and who also understands that I think it's just an implicit part of human nature, to sort of long. There's a Portuguese word, saudade, that I think better captures like the goodness of nostalgia, because it's sort of this word that sort of implies, I've never been to Portugal. My girlfriend's been there and she raves about it. But like, I'll get a feeling of saudade if I'm walking around New York City and it's like raining, and I get this feeling of knowing that I'm going to like lose the moment that I'm in, but wanting to have it forever because it's so beautiful, but knowing I'm going to lose it and sort of being okay with that. That to me is what saudade is. And that's sort of like the essence of nostalgia that I'm okay with living in, is sort of acceptance. Like a nostalgia that's not synonymous with wanting to give up the present for it. In that Caulking the Wagon poem, I think there's a line at the end where I write, "Most days I want to give in to nostalgia, surrender my body to the burn of light curling at the edges of a memory, and trade old stories like currency." And I sympathize with that almost every day. I try to reckon with what it is I want from the past and what it is I can't have, and trying to understand why I feel that way about it. And I think nostalgia is very much okay as long as you are interrogating yourself enough to know why you want that thing back. Because I think longing is part of human nature. And I think longing can be a really beautiful way. I wouldn't never want to live 100% in a state of longing, but in some ways we all do. And I think that's okay. I think so many things are just okay.
Yeah.
But to the effect that it makes you not appreciate what's next to you, to the effect that it might become dangerous for you in the present, that's like the fine line. But no, I'm not someone who's like nostalgia is the worst. Yeah, like that essay you mentioned I wrote about Top Gun. That was both fun and hard to write because I had to go back and be like, why the fuck did I like this movie? And why do I still like it? And what is it that, like, am I okay with that? And, you know, and to really, like, interrogate myself and ask myself, like, what did it actually do for me? What did I take from it that was terrible? You know, what did I take from it that I can now sort of frame as good? I don't know. But I think it's just so much of what I've been trying to do in my life lately is be honest with why I'm feeling what I'm feeling.
Yeah.
And I think any feeling is okay as long as you're coming at it that way.
Well, I just loved that essay, and I'll put a link in the show notes. It's I encourage everyone who's listening to go check it out. It was really something. Why don't we take a quick little break and then come back and do the second segment?
Sure.
So for the second segment, I always invite the guest to bring a topic of their own, which could be whatever you'd like to talk about. So what would you like to talk about tonight?
When you said to have something to talk about for the second part, I sort of read it and I was like, I'll think of something. Not knowing that, like, for the past month or a few weeks, I've been, like, reading this book on whales and becoming, like, vaguely obsessed with them. But no, I've been reading this book about whales. And,
what's it called?
It's called The Whale. It's a simple title, The Whale, singular.
And who's it by?
It's by Philip. Don't know how to say his last name. I guess it's Hoare, Hoare. He is. It's sort of like part just interesting factoids, part analysis of Moby Dick, part travelogue, and the book mentions like all these like really interesting things. Like you can cut open a whale's tooth and read the inside of the tooth like you would the rings of a tree to figure out how old the whale is. And there's a whale called the finback whale that can be heard. It's the loudest mammal, I think, in the world, and none of us can hear it because we're, one, not underwater, and two, the sound register is at such a low octave that we wouldn't be able to hear it if we tried. But the whale is so loud that if there's like one whale hanging out in Massachusetts, it can be heard by another whale that's hanging out off the coast of England, all the way underwater. Like 2,000 miles. They can just chill and talk to each other. Part of this is like just like a really childlike fascination on my part, just being like, holy shit, that's fucking unbelievable. But lately what it's sort of made me think about is just like how, I don't know, for thousands of years there were whales talking to each other from 2,000 miles away, and it took us until the 1800s to make a telephone, you know? And we had to really try to make a telephone. And in the making of that telephone, we probably killed a lot of whales. And I'm not like an environmentalist, but in the making of that telephone, we probably used whale oil for something, to light a candle so we could work all night. We ate fish. We fucking, we mined the earth for food. We used whale oil to lubricate steam engines so we could get materials from one place to the other and lay down power lines. I don't know. I'm not smart enough to know any of this shit, but it took us so long as humans to do this one thing that someone else had been doing forever. Simply because they could. And I don't, I guess my point is I don't really know what that means, like I just find it really fascinating that we then think as human beings that we are the center of everything. You
There's
know?
something about the ocean and the things that live in it that definitely invite you to contemplate your smallness.
Yeah.
Maybe there's even a connection to what you were talking about before, because there's so much in your writing, whether prose or poetry, that is about an exploration of self, but in a way that any honest exploration of self has to also admit things like flaws and also have a perspective about your place in the universe. And so being faced with something as massive, literally massive as an animal as large as a whale, but also to sort of think about the sort of essential hubris of how we tend to conceive of our relationship to the rest of the world in comparing ourselves to something like a whale. I think there's something there. I can't quite get my arms around it.
Yeah, I think I mean, that's just a good juxtaposition on your part. But you're right. I mean, I think that a lot of this stuff is just stuff I've been thinking about very recently, about like what it means to be honest, what it means to be okay with being small, what it means to be vulnerable and generous, and to sort of de-center yourself from, maybe not from the world, but from like a situation, to understand that not everything is wholly dependent on you. Yeah, you read shit about fucking whales, and like you can drive a car through them. A human being can walk upright through a blue whale's veins. Like that's like like I'm in a room right now that's the size of a blue whale's heart, you know? That's unbelievable.
Yeah.
Like truly, like it's makes no sense. And again, yeah, like I say this without even being someone who's like reading up on how many whales are endangered, and I'm not doing a good job of recycling, and I've never composted a day in my life. These are all things I should be doing, but it sounds so stupid that I'm saying it, but like the more I read about whales, the more I'm like, why do humans exist, you know? And not just why do we exist, but why did we think for so long that the sun moved around us, you know?
Yeah.
It's just, yeah.
You know what this is reminding me of? I think a week or two ago, I was listening to this other podcast, which is an excellent podcast if you're into podcasts, interview podcasts. It's called Between the Covers, and the host name is David Naiman. And he had been interviewing Ursula K. Le Guin. I went back, and he'd interviewed her 3 times, and I went back and listened to all of them right after she died, right after I found out that she died.
Yeah.
One of the interviews, she was talking about how sort of arrogant it is, the way that we think about the rest of the world, and how, like, she was talking about how just because we don't understand what a dog is feeling, that we think that they don't have feelings. And that even in the same way, she was talking about certain, older animistic religions that would ascribe a spirit to something like a stone, but that because of the way that we interrelate with the world now, that we think of a stone as being something inert and don't admit the possibility that it might on some level have something like an awareness, even if it's not an awareness that we would be able to understand. I thought that was really a fascinating thing. And I'm being reminded of that by, this, like that there's something about the idea of a whale singing thousands of years ago and some other whale thousands of miles away singing back to it, and that there's this back and forth going on over millennia, and thinking somehow that this is less important than, I don't know, the Super Bowl is, there's something not right about that perspective, or lack of perspective.
Yeah, I mean,
don't get me wrong, I watched the Super Bowl, so.
Oh yeah, I watched the Super Bowl too. But yeah, I agree, especially with what you brought up about what Ursula said. I think that, again, even back to what we were saying a while ago about most things we will never either know or understand.
Yeah.
You know, I think I'm moving towards a place where I would like to be more okay with mystery. And to try and find the joy in mystery rather than the deep anxiety of it, you know? I mean, I think it's really easy to find... This is also sort of hypocritical because it's like there's a mystery about whales, and it's easy to find joy in that because they're fucking whales, and like that's great. And like if I told someone crazy whale facts and they were like sad about them, it's a joyful thing that we even know the things we know about whales. But then there are mysteries about the future, and there's like mysteries about what happens when we die, or there's mysteries before then about like in 10 years will I be able to have kids, or will I be able to support my family, or will there even be a world, you know, that you should bring a family into. And those mysteries, I think, those cause me some anxiety. So there's obviously different kinds of things we don't know, but I think back to like Ursula's point, and I'm more willing to sort of just believe things now than I am before. If someone came to me and said that they were worshiping a stone, like you mentioned, or that they thought a stone had some sort of animated abilities to understand something, I'd be like, holy shit. That sounds awesome. I'm just more willing to sort of love those things and to relish in those things than I am to sort of actively choose not to wonder at them, you know? And it's what's a big shame is that we do all the things we do as humans knowing the small things we know. That to me is one of the greatest shames of humanity, is we know so little, and yet whether it comes to how we treat other people, or how we treat the environment, or how we treat whales, these are small, tiny things we know. Like, we know that we're fucking destroying the planet, and yet we still choose to do it. And that's like without knowing if stones can feel, right? We hunted whales for so long, and we stopped only when we knew the extent to which they were able to think and feel. And it was like that small piece of knowing that made us be like, have some semblance of compassion.
Yeah.
But we know like 0.0001% of everything in the world, and yet we actively choose to harm so much of it, including the people in it. That's what whales have taught me.
Yeah. Well, so there's one last question that I ask everybody before we finish up, and that is whether there is a piece of art or literature or just general creativity that you've experienced recently that meant something to you.
I read this book not too long ago called So Many Olympic Exertions by this woman, Annalise Chen. It's from the small press called Kaya Press. And I originally got it for my girlfriend and then stole it from her. And it was one of my favorite books I've read in a long time. It's like this novel written in fragments, and it's about this woman whose friend commits suicide and is trying to finish her PhD and can't finish it, and becomes obsessed with videos of athletes failing at things. And it's such a weird premise for a novel. But the novel sort of meditates on like this idea of why we even do anything at all. and it's funny too. It's mostly like very harrowing, and but I haven't read anything like it that sort of captured the angst and drive of living in this world where so much is telling you to do things and you either don't want to do them, or you mindlessly do them, or you do them because you think it'll get you to that next thing, and it captures all of that so well, and I would recommend it to literally anyone who's alive.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for talking with me. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you, Mike. That was a lot of fun.
Okay, so as I mentioned at the top, I'm giving away 2 copies of Devin's book, In This Quiet Church of Night I Say Amen. If you'd like to enter the drawing for that book, here's what you do. First, sign up for the show's email newsletter by going to keepthechannelopen.com/connect and filling out the form there. And if you're already signed up, great, you're done with that step. Next, just drop me an email at podcast@keepthechannelopen.com and let me know that you're entering the drawing. And then that's all you have to do. But if you'd like to increase your odds, once you're signed up for the newsletter, you can tweet about the episode and tag me at Channel Open Pod to get an extra entry. And all of the subscribers to our Patreon campaign also get an extra entry. So good luck, everybody. And I'll be announcing the winner on Facebook and Twitter on Wednesday, April 7th. And that is our show. If you'd like to get in touch, you can find all of the show's contact and social media info in the show notes. If you'd like to support the show, a monthly pledge in any amount to our Patreon campaign is greatly appreciated. You can find that at patreon.com/sakeriver. That's sake like the drink and river like river. Our theme music is by Poddington Bear. You can find more of his music available for licensing at soundofpicture.com. We will be back on April 11th with a conversation with photographer Morgan De Luna, so be sure and come back for that one. And until then, remember, keep the channel open.